Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time before soft pillows and memory foam. Before duvets and spring coils. Back when going to bed didn't mean sinking into comfort but into, well, whatever was available and not currently alive. So let's dim the lights. Settle in. Maybe tuck the blanket just under your chin. Because tonight, we're going to talk about the long, strange history of sleep before anyone thought to invent a proper mattress. It's funny to think about it, but for most of human history, sleep was more of a suggestion than a guaranteed nightly luxury. There were no bedtimes in the modern sense. No bedtime routines, no reading lamps. Just darkness, exhaustion, and the eternal question of where you could collapse without being bitten by something. Let's start with the basics, the ground. Because that's where the earliest humans slept. Not metaphorically. Literally the ground. And not even the nice, even kind we imagine from cave paintings. We're talking cold, uneven, occasionally damp earth. If you were lucky, maybe you had a bit of grass or animal skin to soften it. But most of the time, you simply made do. You might dig a small hollow to curl up in, sort of like a very sad, prehistoric beanbag. Or you'd sleep in the same spot where your fire burned earlier, still warm but smoky. Imagine drifting off to the soft scent of slightly burnt mammoth fat. Of course, humans being inventive creatures, it didn't take long to realize that comfort was nice. So they started layering things. Leaves, reeds, straw, moss, whatever could create a bit of cushioning. Early beds were basically nature's compost piles, only slightly less decayed. And it worked surprisingly well. Some archaeological digs have found grass bedding dating back over 70,000 years in what's now South Africa. People would layer grasses and herbs, not just for softness, but also for pest control. Certain plants repel insects, and nothing ruins a nap faster than a termite infestation in your bed. It's one of those small reminders that even in the Stone Age, people wanted to be cozy. Even if cozy meant sleeping on a pile of drying grass while hyenas screamed outside. As humanity evolved, so did the art of not suffering through the night. By the time farming came around, people had more options. With crops and domesticated animals came straw, and straw changed everything. It was softish, renewable, and much easier to collect than moss. People began to make straw pallets, basically big sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or chaff. These were called pallias, a word that sounds fancy but means sack of hay. If you were poor, that was your bed. If you were rich, you had several sacks of hay, stacked strategically. Luxury, in other words, was having layers of discomfort rather than just one. And of course, straw came with its own issues. It didn't stay fresh. After a few weeks, it would start smelling like something between a barn and a damp sandwich. And bugs loved it. Fleas, mites, even mice sometimes moved in. Which meant that cleaning your bed wasn't about washing sheets. It was about taking your entire sleeping surface out into the yard and setting it on fire or shaking it until the wildlife left. So yes, changing the sheets was a bit more dramatic back then. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because some of the earliest civilizations had already discovered more creative ways to avoid sleeping on the floor. The ancient Egyptians, for example, were rather innovative in the comfort department, although their ideas of comfort differ wildly from ours. They're often credited with creating the first raised beds. Wooden frames that lifted the sleeper off the ground, partly to avoid snakes and scorpions, and partly to show off status. Pharaohs didn't sleep on the earth like peasants. They hovered above it, as if the ground itself were unworthy. Some of these early beds were beautifully carved. Gold-leafed legs, intricate headrests, sometimes shaped like animals. But there was one problem. Egyptian pillows were carved from stone or wood. A curved headrest designed to hold the neck up. It looks elegant in museums, but I can promise, it felt like napping on a loaf of granite. The Egyptians thought it was better for the soul. That elevating the head kept bad spirits away. And maybe it did. But it also gave you the kind of neck cramp that even the gods of sleep would pity. So imagine this, a pharaoh lying on a beautifully painted wooden bed, gold inlay glinting in the candlelight, and his head propped on a block of polished stone. Comfortable? Not remotely. Majestic? Absolutely. Meanwhile, over in Mesopotamia, things were more practical. Their beds were also raised platforms, but they were made from woven reeds or ropes tied across a frame. Sort of an early hammock meets trampoline hybrid. It kept you off the ground, allowed air circulation in the heat, and was easy to repair. Which is to say, a much more sensible idea than a gilded stone headrest. Some wealthier Mesopotamians, though, couldn't resist adding flair. Bronze legs, carved posts, curtains for privacy. It turns out that even 5,000 years ago, people loved to brag about their interior decorating choices. What's fascinating is how early the symbolism of beds appeared. In nearly every ancient culture, being elevated while you slept implied power, purity, or wealth. The higher your bed, the higher your status, literally. It's why in medieval times, noble beds were so absurdly tall you practically needed a ladder to reach them. We'll get to that later, the medieval sleep-climbing championships. Back in prehistoric huts and simple homes, though, sleeping was still a communal affair. You didn't have your own bed, you shared. Whole families would sleep together on the same pile of straw or furs. It kept everyone warm, especially in colder climates. And while it sounds cozy, you can imagine the symphony of sounds that accompanied it. Snoring, coughing, probably someone kicking you in their sleep. Personal space was not a concept. You were just lucky if you got the side of the straw heap without too many sharp twigs. It's strange to think about it now, but the idea of a private bedroom is actually quite modern. For most of history, sleep was public. Not in a scandalous way, just communal. Even kings and queens sometimes slept surrounded by servants, guards, and attendants. Privacy was a privilege almost no one had. By the time we reach ancient Greece, we start to see beds taking on artistic form. The Greeks loved aesthetics, even in sleep. Their beds, called klein, were low couches often made of wood or bronze, with woven supports or mattresses filled with feathers or wool. They were also used for reclining during meals and discussions, because apparently every Greek conversation required at least one person lying down dramatically. It's one of those charming historical details. Imagine Socrates debating ethics while lounging sideways, propped on one elbow, surrounded by crumbs of bread and philosophical indignation. But again, comfort was relative. Wool mattresses weren't exactly soft, and sheets were rare luxuries. Still, the Greeks were moving toward the idea that sleep could be pleasant. Not just a daily necessity, but a mild pleasure. And that's progress. The Romans, naturally, took the concept and made it extravagant. Romans didn't just have beds, they had entire rooms dedicated to reclining. Feasting beds, nap couches, sleep chambers with embroidered linens. The wealthy even imported goose feathers for their mattresses. Because, of course, they did. In Roman villas, bedrooms were more like mini temples to rest. Marble frames, bronze headboards, silk sheets if you were extremely rich. And, in a charmingly Roman twist, sometimes these beds were shared not only with spouses but also with servants, concubines, or, if you were Emperor Caligula, your own sense of delusion. What's interesting is that Roman beds were surprisingly small by modern standards. Often too short for a person to lie completely flat. People at the time tended to sleep propped up slightly, perhaps to aid digestion after consuming the entire Mediterranean buffet at dinner. So if you've ever felt guilty about falling asleep on the couch after eating too much, you're basically continuing an ancient Roman tradition. But let's drift back to the simpler folk. Because not everyone was lounging on imported feathers. Most Romans slept on straw-stuffed sacks, very similar to what peasants in medieval Europe would use centuries later. They'd stuff straw into coarse linen or wool cloth, tie it shut, and replace it when it started smelling like livestock. Which, honestly, was probably all the time. Sometimes, the poorer classes didn't even bother with the sack. They just spread straw directly on the floor, maybe added a blanket, and called it a night. And after a long day hauling amphorae or building aqueducts, that was probably more than enough. So, through all of this, from grass piles to gilded couches, one theme keeps returning. Humans have always been tired. But not all tiredness is equal. Some of us have been comfortably tired, and others, just tired. If you were a pharaoh, you had a fancy bed and an aching neck. If you were a farmer, you had straw and fleas. And somewhere in between, humanity kept searching for that perfect balance, the art of resting without suffering. It's oddly relatable, isn't it? We spend so much time now trying to find the right mattress firmness, the best pillow shape, the perfect sleep temperature. And yet, 30,000 years ago, someone was probably lying on their pile of reeds thinking, this could be softer. And that's where we'll pause our journey tonight. Next time, we'll drift forward into the medieval world, a place where beds became absurdly tall, curtains were status symbols, and sleep was practically a performance. But before we drift onward, if you had to choose between a sack of straw or an Egyptian stone pillow, which would you pick? Let me know in the comments. I have a feeling neither option wins, but I'm curious. So, we've left behind the straw pallets and Roman couches. We've stepped softly through time and found ourselves somewhere in the early Middle Ages. The candles are flickering low, and a draft slips under the wooden door. Outside, a rooster is confused about whether it's morning or not. Inside, someone's trying to sleep on what they proudly call a bed, though it looks more like a wooden crate stuffed with agricultural leftovers. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time when sleep was complicated, partly because everything in the Middle Ages was complicated. Politics, religion, hygiene, personal space, none of it simple. And yet, somehow, beds became one of the strangest symbols of power and prestige in the entire era. Let's start with the peasants, because, as usual, they didn't get the fancy version. For the vast majority of people, the bed was a straw mattress on the floor. Not the romantic hay bale setup seen in movies, but an actual sack, often made of rough canvas or ticking cloth, filled with straw or feathers if you were lucky. These were called tickings or paillasses. And while they sound rustic and charming, they were mostly itchy, uneven, and alive with tiny jumping residents. Bedbugs were basically medieval roommates. And the average peasant had no means to evict them except through vigorous shaking, smoking, or sheer denial. So yes, medieval people didn't just sleep tight. They tied their beds tight, literally, to keep the ropes from sagging under them. The phrase, sleep tight, actually comes from that. Beds were often a wooden frame with interlaced ropes holding up the mattress. Over time, those ropes would loosen, and the bed would sag like a hammock for one. So before bed, you tightened the ropes. Hence, sleep tight, an ancient bit of home maintenance disguised as a bedtime wish. Now, if you happen to be slightly better off, perhaps a merchant or a guild craftsman, your bed might be off the ground. That was a big deal. Rats, cold drafts, and other nightly horrors lurked close to the floor. So a raised bed meant safety, and, of course, bragging rights. These beds were built from heavy oak or walnut, with 4 solid posts. And they weren't just for sleeping. They were storage units, family seating areas, even birthing stations. The medieval bed was a multipurpose piece of furniture long before IKEA caught on. But what really made beds important wasn't just comfort. It was symbolism. Beds were status objects. For nobles and royals, the bed wasn't just where you rested. It was where you received guests, conducted business, and occasionally died very dramatically. Let's drift into a medieval castle for a moment. Imagine a huge hall lit by torches. The smell of wax and damp stone fills the air. Upstairs, behind a heavy curtain, sits the lord's chamber, dominated by a towering carved bed. The nobleman or lady might hold meetings there, still half-propped on pillows. Visitors would kneel or stand nearby, respectfully keeping their eyes down. It sounds strange now, but at the time, the bedroom was public space for the powerful. The higher your rank, the less privacy you had. Sleep itself was semi-sacred, and a good bed was an extension of royal authority. A king's bed might be draped in velvet, lined with ermine fur, embroidered with gold thread. It might even travel with him. Kings and queens often brought their beds wherever they went. Because sleeping on a common mattress? Unthinkable. Their beds were disassembled, packed up, and reassembled at each new castle or camp. Imagine your furniture having its own entourage. The curtains around these grand beds served more than one purpose. They helped block drafts, yes. But they were also a status symbol. The more layers, tassels, and fabrics your bed curtains had, the wealthier you appeared. A poor person's bed might be a sack of straw with a blanket. A noble's bed was practically a textile fortress. Velvet on the outside, silk on the inside, sometimes with inner linings to keep warmth in. Privacy was precious, but even more precious was showing everyone else that you could afford privacy. These curtains created a little cocoon of heat in the otherwise freezing stone rooms. In the winter, when castles dropped below freezing inside, You'd pile on wool blankets, animal furs, and whoever else you could fit beside you. Because that's another fun medieval fact. People didn't always sleep alone. Even nobles often shared their beds. Sometimes with relatives, servants, or visiting guests. Not for scandalous reasons, well, not always, but because beds were expensive. If someone offered you space beside the fire, you said yes and pretended not to notice their snoring. Speaking of strange sleeping habits, medieval people didn't sleep through the night the way we do. They practiced what's now called segmented sleep. They'd go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight. This first sleep was followed by a period of quiet wakefulness. They might pray, talk, tend the fire, or even visit neighbors. Then they'd drift back into their second sleep until dawn. This pattern shows up in countless old diaries, letters, and even medical texts. Apparently, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't considered odd, it was normal. The modern idea of one solid 8-hour stretch of sleep would have seemed almost alien to them. So next time you wake up at 3 a.m. and stare at the ceiling, remember, you're just sleeping like a medieval villager. Congratulations on your historical accuracy. Now, let's take a closer look at what exactly went into these medieval mattresses. Feathers were the gold standard, soft, warm, and obnoxiously expensive. Only the very wealthy could afford entire mattresses filled with goose down. A cheaper alternative was wool. It was coarser, heavier, and sometimes smelled faintly of sheep no matter how many times you washed it. And for everyone else, there was straw. Always straw. People changed it regularly to keep away pests, though regularly might mean once every season if you were lucky. There's even a medieval household manual from the 1400s that helpfully advises. Ye straw of thy bed shall be chonged at ye quarter. Meaning, replace it 4 times a year. Imagine how crunchy that old straw must have been by the end of winter. And washing sheets? That was a whole ordeal. Linen was precious, and washing was labor-intensive. Many people simply aired their bedding out in the sun, beat it with sticks to remove dust, and called it good. It's not exactly the fresh linen experience we imagine today. But not all beds were indoors. In warmer months, it wasn't uncommon for people, especially peasants, to sleep outside. Barn lofts, porches, even haystacks served as makeshift bedrooms. Farmhands might simply curl up near the animals for warmth. It sounds rustic and pastoral, but it mostly smelled like manure and regret. There are records of entire families sleeping in one big room with the animals in a partitioned space. Partly for warmth, partly for safety. At least you didn't need an alarm clock, the cows would wake you right on time. It's fascinating, though, how communal sleep continued well into the late Middle Ages. Privacy just wasn't the goal. Survival and shared heat were. For the wealthy, though, bedtime was a ceremony. Servants would warm the sheets with hot stones wrapped in cloth. They'd plump the feather mattress and chase away any suspicious crawling guests. The lord or lady might then retire behind their heavy curtains, surrounded by silks, with a tiny candle burning low. And here's the irony, even with all that luxury, the rooms were still freezing. No central heating, remember. So while you might have gold-threaded sheets, you'd still wake up with frost on your nose. Imagine the sheer drama of being royalty. Wearing velvet robes to bed, sleeping beneath fur blankets, and still shivering like a leaf because your castle had more wind leaks than walls. Beds in monasteries were another story entirely. Monks took vows of poverty and discomfort quite seriously. Their beds were often wooden boards with thin straw mats. Sometimes they slept sitting up to avoid indulgence. Because apparently, even lying horizontally could be too luxurious. One particularly cheerful monk wrote that sleep should remind us of death. Which, if you ask me, sounds like someone who badly needed a nap. Still, there was discipline in it. Sleep as a test of devotion. Every era, every class, every belief system found a way to turn sleep into a moral issue. By the late medieval period, beds were evolving again. We start seeing canopy beds, tall, draped structures designed not just for warmth but grandeur. Carved posts, embroidered headboards, ornate testers above the bed. These were the centerpieces of noble bedrooms. If you were invited into someone's bedchamber, you knew you'd arrived socially. And yet, even then, comfort wasn't exactly guaranteed. Springs didn't exist yet. Mattresses sagged, ropes creaked, and the air smelled faintly of whatever herbs you'd stuffed inside to keep the fleas away. But perception was everything. If your bed looked magnificent, no one questioned whether you actually slept well. What's oddly sweet is that for all the pomp and symbolism, bedtime rituals were surprisingly human. People said prayers, stretched out tired limbs, told stories to children, and worried about tomorrow. There's something universal about that moment just before sleep. No matter the century, people always looked for small ways to make it softer, safer, quieter. It's humbling in a way. All those lords and peasants, monks and merchants, trying to get comfortable in their imperfect little nests. So tonight, as we drift through time, let's imagine that medieval scene once more. A fire burning low. A heavy wooden bed creaking gently. Curtains drawn tight against the cold. Somewhere outside, the night wind whispers through the courtyard. And inside, someone, maybe a weary servant, maybe a queen, closes their eyes and finally lets go. For all our progress, maybe not much has changed. The materials are softer, the rooms warmer. But sleep still feels like the same small surrender it always has. Before we move on to our next stop, the Renaissance and the age of embroidered dreams, let me ask you this. If you lived in medieval times, would you rather sleep in the peasant's straw bed, shared with the family, or the noble's freezing velvet palace? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious who's braver about bedbugs versus drafts. So we've wandered out of the smoky medieval bedchamber. The straw's been replaced, the fire's dying low, and humanity is stretching its legs into something new. The world is waking up, painting, thinking, composing, and, naturally, redesigning how it sleeps. Welcome to the Renaissance, that glittering age of rediscovery, where artists debated beauty, philosophers debated meaning, and nobles debated thread counts. It's a time when beds stopped being simply places to collapse. They became stages, for power, for love, and occasionally, for tragic family drama that would have made a soap opera blush. If you were a European aristocrat in the 15th or 16th century, your bed was the crown jewel of your home. Not your library, not your art collection, your bed. The same object your ancestors had stuffed with straw was now being carved, painted, and draped with more fabric than most people owned in a lifetime. The wealthy commissioned towering four-poster beds, often reaching almost to the ceiling. The posts were thick, ornately carved, sometimes gilded, and topped with a canopy, the tester. From this canopy hung luxurious curtains, damask, brocade, velvet, in deep reds, golds, and blues. The curtains were drawn not just for warmth but for ceremony. Because, by this point, your bed was not just where you slept. It was where people came to see you. In royal courts, important guests were often received in bedchambers, not drawing rooms. The monarch or noble would recline on the bed, propped up on cushions, wearing night robes made of silk. Visitors entered quietly, bowed, and spoke softly, as if stepping into a sacred place. And in a sense, it was. The bedchamber had become a theater of power. Take Louis XIV of France, for example. He practically turned sleeping into a political act. Each morning, he performed a ritual called the lever, the royal rising. High-ranking courtiers would gather to watch him wake up, stretch, and eat breakfast in bed. It was a privilege, an honor, and a clear statement. Even his first yawn of the day was state business. Imagine starting every morning with 30 nobles watching you blink awake. No pressure, of course. But Louis wasn't alone in that. All across Europe, royal waking and sleeping became ceremonies. The Renaissance didn't invent luxury, it simply made it official policy. Now, for the rest of society, things were less grand but still evolving. As trade expanded and textiles became more accessible, ordinary people began to enjoy softer bedding. Feather mattresses trickled down from the nobility to the merchant class. Wool and linen sheets became more common. People started layering fabrics, undersheets, oversheets, and bed covers, a small revolution in coziness. If you were moderately well off, you might own a featherbed, a bolster pillow, and maybe even 2 sheets, one to lie on, one to cover yourself. This sounds basic now, but it was a major upgrade from straw sacks and itchy wool blankets. Beds were still often shared, husband, wife, sometimes children or guests, but slowly the idea of personal comfort began to matter more. And oh, how people bragged about it. Renaissance wills and household inventories are full of proud listings like, One bed of walnut with tester and curtains of red silk. Item: a feather bed stuffed with down of goose, one bolster, one counterpane of embroidered linen. A feather bed wasn't just furniture. It was financial security, something valuable enough to pass on to your heirs. Imagine inheriting grandma's old mattress and feeling genuinely honored. The 16th century also saw the emergence of bed hangings and wall tapestries, which turned bedrooms into warm, fabric-lined cocoons. Stone walls were cold and drafty, and these heavy textiles helped trap heat. They also displayed one's wealth and taste, the Renaissance equivalent of luxury wallpaper. The most extravagant beds had entire canopies lined with embroidery depicting mythological scenes. Cupid here, Venus there, maybe a few cherubs hovering dangerously close to a tassel. It was comfort through art, sleep as a performance of refinement. And if you were very rich, your bed was so elaborate that it sometimes became stationary. Too valuable to move, too massive to fit through doors. One famous example is the Great Bed of Ware, built in England around 1590. It's over 10 feet wide, large enough for at least 4 couples, and was once used as a tourist attraction. People traveled to see a bed, because even then, we loved oversized furniture. But not everyone was reclining under embroidered ceilings. The working classes of the Renaissance world were still sleeping much as they had in the Middle Ages. Simple wooden frames, straw or chaff mattresses, and shared sleeping quarters. Though slowly, domestic comfort was trickling downward. Urban households began investing in modest featherbeds, and even apprentices sometimes had small rope beds of their own. One interesting development was the rise of cradle and child beds, separate from the parents. That might sound ordinary now, but it marked the slow emergence of family privacy. Before this, everyone, children, servants, even visitors, might share one large bed. Now, homes were beginning to separate spaces. A subtle but meaningful change. In cities like Florence or Venice, artisans began selling ready-made beds and mattresses. The early furniture industry was waking up. People could buy comfort instead of building it. Of course, quality varied wildly. Feather mattresses could be light and fluffy or lumpy and moldy, depending on the feathers. The best were goose down. The worst, well, you didn't ask too many questions about where the stuffing came from. And let's not forget the smell. Without modern cleaning, beds absorbed everything: sweat, smoke, food crumbs, perfume, maybe the occasional midnight snack accident. Household manuals from the time gently advised airing your bedding upon each fine day. Which is a poetic way of saying, take it outside before it develops its own ecosystem. As Europe's elite embraced comfort, they also became oddly fascinated with sleep science, or at least what passed for it. Doctors and philosophers debated the proper sleeping position. Some argued you should start on your right side to warm the body, then turn left to cool it. Others warned that too much soft bedding made you lazy and morally weak. Yes, even then, comfort came with judgment. In the Renaissance mind, sleep was both necessary and suspicious. Too little, and you were unhealthy. Too much, and you were sinful. A 16th-century moral guide even warned readers that lying long in bed breedeth idleness and lust. So apparently, the snooze button was already controversial. Among the upper classes, the bedchamber itself transformed into a personal sanctuary. Walls were painted or paneled in warm colors. Windows were draped in heavy cloth. And furniture, chairs, chests, small tables, clustered around the main attraction, the bed. The bedroom became less communal, more private. A space for rest, intimacy, and luxury. In many Renaissance paintings, the bed is right there in the background, symbolizing both wealth and domestic virtue. Mary and the infant Jesus are often shown near beds draped in rich red curtains, a sign of love, warmth, and purity. Even artists couldn't resist turning sleep into symbolism. Let's drift a little into the night habits of the time. The wealthy often went to bed late. Dinner might be served at 9 or 10 at night, followed by music or conversation. Candlelight glowed against painted ceilings. Bedtime wasn't a rushed thing, it was a ritual, a graceful slide from social life into dreams. Nightwear became fashionable too. Gone were the shapeless medieval nightshirts. In came embroidered linen gowns, lace-edged caps, and, for some, perfumed gloves, because heaven forbid you go to sleep smelling ordinary. And yes, there were perfumes for beds. Herbal sachets tucked between sheets, lavender water sprinkled on pillows. Even then, people knew the power of scent in creating comfort. In Italy, Spain, and France, bed-making became almost an art. Servants carefully layered fabrics in order: mattress, bolster, undersheet, top sheet, blankets, coverlet, and finally a decorative spread. It was a miniature architecture of comfort. A few manuals survive describing exactly how a proper bed should be dressed. Too few wrinkles, and you'd look pretentious. Too many, and you'd seem lazy. The eternal human struggle. Even in sleep, appearances mattered. But it wasn't all silk and feathers. Let's not forget the Renaissance had its share of sleep problems. Cities were noisy. Insects were everywhere. And heat was hard to control in multi-story homes. People burned candles and charcoal braziers for warmth, sometimes with disastrous results. There are records of beds catching fire in the night because someone fell asleep beside an open flame. And yet, through all the discomfort, people still dreamed, literally. Dreams were taken seriously. Books and sermons offered interpretations. A flying dream meant ambition. A drowning dream meant guilt. A dream of beds, according to one English treatise, meant quietness of mind. So perhaps the dream interpreters were optimists. What's charming about this era is how aware people became of their own rest. Writers and philosophers began describing sleep in detail. Poets compared it to death, lovers to surrender, thinkers to restoration. Shakespeare, ever poetic, called it the balm of hurt minds. Though given the average 16th century mattress, it might have been more like the moderately scratchy bandage of hurt minds. But beneath all the rhetoric, one thing was clear: people were starting to believe that sleep could be beautiful. Not just necessary, but restorative, even artistic. That idea would blossom in centuries to come, shaping everything from bedroom design to the invention of the first real spring mattress. So as our Renaissance dream fades and the candlelight flickers low, imagine the scene. A carved bed, heavy velvet curtains drawn. A faint scent of lavender in the air. Somewhere in the corner, a servant folds linens for morning. And on the bed, someone sighs softly, half prince, half philosopher, fully human. Trying to find that same elusive peace we all chase when we close our eyes. History keeps moving. The bedding changes, the names change, the fabrics grow softer. But the act of surrendering to sleep? That's eternal. Before we drift into the next chapter, the grand age of powdered wigs and excessive embroidery, tell me in the comments. Would you rather sleep like a Renaissance noble surrounded by luxury and candlelight, or like a medieval peasant by the fire with your family? Different kinds of warmth, I suppose. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, we're now drifting deeper into the centuries, past the hay piles and straw ticks, past the smelly taverns and monastery cells, into the softly ridiculous world of royal sleep. Because for the elite, even sleeping was a form of performance. Imagine you're a medieval noble, say, the Duke of Burgundy. It's the year 1420, and you've already spent half your day reminding peasants that you own their souls. The least you can do, you think, is rest like a demigod. So, naturally, your bed isn't just furniture. It's an announcement of power. It's carved, gilded, painted, perfumed, and sometimes, inconveniently, occupied by 6 small dogs and a priest. Royal beds were enormous not for comfort, but for status. The bigger the bed, the more important you seemed. The French kings built literal stages for theirs, complete with steps, curtains, and gold-threaded canopies. It was less a place to sleep and more a shrine to themselves. One 15th-century chronicler described the bed of Charles VI, the beloved, though that seems generous, as a small palace within a room. It took up half the chamber, smelled faintly of rose oil and sweat, and required servants just to maintain the drapery. The irony, of course, is that Charles VI spent much of his reign believing he was made of glass and couldn't sleep at all. So, yes, the man with one of the most expensive beds in Europe was terrified of turning over in it. Let's drift over to England for a moment. There, the kings were also quite fond of enormous sleeping arrangements, though the reasons were slightly different. Medieval English monarchs often shared their beds, not romantically, but politically. It was considered a mark of favor to be invited to sleep with the king, meaning you shared warmth and maybe a few muttered secrets before dawn. Henry VII, for instance, was known for being extremely cautious about who got near his bed. After all, he'd clawed his way to the throne through wars and suspicion. His bedchamber was so tightly guarded that he installed what we'd now call a security team just outside the curtains. But within those silken walls, Henry slept on a straw-stuffed mattress, elevated by several woolen layers, because despite all his money, he still didn't trust feathers. He thought they harbored malicious humors. It seems even kings can have oddly specific bedtime fears. And speaking of royal sleeping quirks, perhaps none were more famous or stranger than those of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis didn't just sleep. He performed sleeping. His levee and coucher ceremonies, literally the getting up and going to bed rituals, were attended by dozens of courtiers. Imagine needing an audience just to take off your shoes. Every evening, nobles would crowd around the royal bed as the king undressed. There was a strict order to who handed him his nightshirt, who pulled the curtains, who extinguished the candle. Those small gestures meant everything, the difference between political rise or disgrace. And Louis loved it. The ritual turned rest into theater. The man was so addicted to control that he even choreographed his naps. His bed itself was, predictably, spectacular, 20 feet wide, embroidered with gold lilies, framed in silver, with crimson velvet sheets. You could probably land a small aircraft on it. Yet historians note that Louis rarely actually slept there. He often drifted off in smaller, more practical beds in side rooms, leaving the grand one for show. Because of course he did. But this obsession with ritualized sleep wasn't limited to France. In Tudor England, Elizabeth I had what might be described as a lifelong war against relaxation. She was terrified of being poisoned, so she never slept in the same bed 2 nights in a row. Every castle she visited, and she visited dozens, had to maintain a room with a ready-made bed, complete with fresh straw, perfumed linens, and guards. It was exhausting. But then again, she was ruling over courtiers who poisoned each other for fun, so you can't blame her entirely. Elizabeth's beds, though, were something to behold. One contemporary described a bed so high one must ascend by ladder, covered with crimson velvet and quilted with silver thread. The mattress, stuffed with the feathers of swans. The symbolism there wasn't subtle. It's funny, really. So much effort spent on the illusion of comfort, and yet these monarchs rarely slept well. Sleep, for them, was a fragile political act, never private, never peaceful. Now, let's step away from palaces for a bit and wander back down to the common folk. Because while kings were staging bedtime ceremonies, most peasants were still making do with a humble bed of earth. That phrase isn't poetic, it's literal. In poorer villages, especially in colder parts of northern Europe, people would dig a shallow pit in the floor of their huts and fill it with dried grass or leaves. Then they'd lay a blanket of rough wool over it and sleep like potatoes in a trench. It sounds miserable, but it worked. The earth insulated heat, and the pit kept people from rolling into drafts. Entire families, sometimes a goat or two, slept together in those hollows. And they did it in shifts. First sleep and second sleep were real things in pre-industrial Europe. People often went to bed soon after sunset, woke around midnight, chatted, prayed, maybe even visited neighbors, then went back for their second sleep until dawn. It's oddly communal, isn't it? Sleep wasn't the solitary, 8-hour affair we know today. It was flexible, social, and strangely practical. You can almost picture it, flickering firelight, the smell of damp hay, someone muttering a prayer before turning over, a chicken hopping too close to the embers. Comfort wasn't guaranteed, but routine was. And sometimes that's just as good. Now, not everyone was sleeping directly on dirt. As trade grew and fabrics became cheaper, the middle class started experimenting with layered bedding. Feathers if you could afford them, wool if you couldn't, straw beneath it all to keep the floor chill away. Even small details became social markers. A linen sheet meant you were doing all right. A wool blanket dyed red meant you were aspiring. And if you had embroidered pillowcases, well, congratulations, you were someone's idea of fancy. But bedding wasn't always clean. Far from it. Imagine years of sweat, dust, fleas, and candle wax building up in those layers. Some people sprinkled herbs like lavender or mint to mask the smell. Others simply accepted that their bed smelled like a damp barn. There's something comforting about that, in a weird way, knowing that even medieval people couldn't escape bad laundry days. And since we've drifted this far into history's bedrooms, it's worth mentioning that privacy wasn't really a concept until quite recently. Even the wealthy often slept with servants nearby, sharing the same air, the same space, and sometimes the same lice. In great houses, beds were placed in wardrobes or alcoves, with curtains drawn to block drafts, but never walls. The idea of a separate, locked bedroom was considered antisocial, even suspicious. People were expected to share. And yes, that meant you might wake up next to someone you barely knew, but hey, it kept the place warm. There's an almost communal poetry to that world. Sleep was a shared act, a necessity more than a pleasure. And maybe that's what makes studying it so quietly fascinating. The closer people lived to survival, the less they fussed about the perfect pillow or the number of mattress coils. Still, it's impossible not to chuckle a little when you think of the contrast. Peasants burrowed in hay, nobles buried under embroidered silk. Two extremes of the same human need, just wanting a few hours of rest. If you had to choose, though, which one would you pick? The dirt pit warmed by goats, or the royal bed watched by 30 courtiers? Tell me in the comments which sounds worse. Let's drift onward now, toward how the industrial age began to change everything, when sleep became mechanical, when springs creaked into existence, and when humans decided that maybe comfort could be engineered after all. What do you think? Would you rather nap in a hay pit or under a canopy of gold? Tell me in the comments before we wander into the next era. Hey everyone! If you're still here, still half awake, maybe tucked under your own version of a haystack, let's drift forward. We've lingered in the medieval dirt long enough. The smell of straw and wood smoke is fading now, replaced by something new, the scent of coal, iron, and ambition. Welcome to the industrial age. It's the 18th century, and humanity is finally beginning to question everything, even how it sleeps. Because, of course, the minute humans learn to mass-produce spoons, someone inevitably decides to mass-produce comfort. Before this period, the bed was still mostly a handmade object. Every frame, every mattress, every sheet came from a local craftsman or, more often, from your own family's effort. You slept on what your grandmother stuffed, sewed, or fluffed by hand. But as factories spread across Britain and Europe, something quietly revolutionary began. Sleep became a business. Let's start with the simplest invention, the bed frame. In medieval homes, a frame was often just a platform or a box. But by the 1700s, cast iron was making its way into everything from bridges to bedsteads. People realized that metal didn't attract bedbugs, an absolutely massive discovery in an age obsessed with invisible vermin. So iron beds became the new luxury. Strong, gleaming, cool to the touch. Advertisements bragged about how uninviting to the insect race they were. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Humanity had reached the point where it could power entire cities, yet still framed its progress around the desperate hope of a bug-free nap. By the 1800s, bed design had turned into a minor arms race. Each manufacturer promised better support, better ventilation, better hygiene. Wooden frames got fancy curves and carvings. Iron ones got brass knobs so shiny they could blind you at dawn. And then came the biggest change of all, the spring. Before springs, mattresses were mostly sacks, heavy, lumpy things filled with straw, wool, or feathers. Over time they flattened, molded, and made funny noises. But in 1857, an inventor named Samuel Pratt patented something new, the coil spring mattress. At first, people were skeptical. The idea of sleeping on metal coils seemed a bit industrial. One critic called it a contrivance for restless souls. But the difference was immediate. Springs distributed weight more evenly. They bounced slightly, giving sleepers the illusion of floating. Soon enough, everyone wanted one, especially the middle class, who were discovering the joys of buying comfort they didn't have to make themselves. You can almost picture it, a Victorian couple walking into a department store, staring reverently at a bed displayed like a cathedral altar, whispering about how modern it looked. Of course, as with all Victorian innovations, there was also a dark side. Industrial mattresses were heavy, filled with dubious materials, and rarely cleaned. Factories churned them out cheaply, and nobody thought about what happened after 10 years of sweat and coal dust soaked in. It wasn't uncommon for families to pass mattresses down generations, heirlooms of mildew and mystery. And speaking of mystery, it's worth noting that the Victorians had a complicated relationship with sleep itself. They saw it as both necessary and slightly shameful. Productivity was everything, so sleeping too much was considered lazy. Yet at the same time, sleep was moralized. Good Christians, it was said, should sleep cleanly and decently, preferably on a firm surface that discouraged sinful lounging. So yes, even rest had a moral angle. You couldn't just nap, you had to nap virtuously. As the 19th century marched on, bedrooms themselves began to change too. In cities like London and Paris, middle-class families started carving out entire rooms dedicated to sleep. Privacy, that rare luxury in medieval times, was now a mark of respectability. Bedrooms became places not only to rest, but to display taste. Lace curtains, embroidered coverlets, ornamental pillows that nobody was allowed to touch. One etiquette guide from 1868 advised, "The bedchamber should appear neither too sensual nor too austere," which is a polite Victorian way of saying, make it look inviting, but not like you enjoy it too much. Still, for all their prudishness, Victorians were obsessed with bedroom products. Feather pillows, horsehair mattresses, velvet hangings, bed warmers filled with coals, it was a booming market. Some catalogues even offered medicinal mattresses, infused with camphor, claiming to cure melancholy and gout. Nothing like a good night's sleep and mild chemical exposure. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the newly industrialized United States was going through its own bedding revolution. Immigrant craftsmen brought European styles, but Americans, in typical fashion, made them bigger, bolder, and more expensive. By the late 1800s, the brass bed had become a symbol of prosperity. Glossy ads showed happy couples smiling in spotless rooms, their new iron and brass frames gleaming like locomotives. "The bed that endures," one ad proudly proclaimed. Of course, it didn't mention that brass tarnishes in weeks. But marketing had arrived, and the mattress industry would never be the same again. This was also when sleep itself started to become scientific. Doctors began publishing advice on posture and bedding. They warned against soft mattresses, claiming they caused spinal torpor and moral weakness. Others argued that firm beds improved circulation, discipline, and character. It was less medicine and more moral sermon, but people took it seriously. Still, beneath all the pseudoscience, something real was happening. Humanity was finally understanding that sleep wasn't just a nightly pause, it was health and comfort and identity. You can trace this change in the language of advertisements. Early industrial ads bragged about durability. By 1900, they bragged about dreams. One company called Simmons even adopted the slogan, "Sleep is life." A bit dramatic, perhaps, but they weren't wrong. And speaking of Simmons, yes, the same Simmons that still makes mattresses today, they were pioneers in taking bedding from craft to commerce. In 1870, they invented a machine that could mass-produce coil springs, cutting the price of a mattress by nearly half. It's strange to think about. For centuries, sleep had been a private, homegrown experience. Now it was a product, wrapped in branding and sold in catalogs. You could buy dreams in convenient installments. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Some old-fashioned Europeans grumbled that modern mattresses made people soft. Hard surfaces, they insisted, were better for the spirit. Napoleon supposedly slept on a camp bed of wood and horsehair even at the height of his empire, claiming it kept his mind ready for war. Which is one way to justify being cranky. But ordinary people were thrilled. For the first time in history, working families could afford real comfort, something previously reserved for nobles. Mass production democratized rest. That's one of those quiet revolutions nobody celebrates. The moment human beings stopped seeing comfort as a sin and started seeing it as a right. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. The Industrial Revolution also introduced new kinds of sleeplessness. Factory schedules disrupted the natural rhythm of first sleep and second sleep. Artificial light kept workers awake longer. Cities hummed, machines roared, and for the first time, humanity began to measure rest against the ticking of a clock. Sleep hygiene became a term. Bedtime became an obligation. We started regulating rest like everything else, for efficiency. And yet, despite all that progress and noise, the old habits lingered. Even in soot-covered towns, people still stuffed their mattresses with straw. They still beat the lumps out with sticks, still complained about drafts, still put lavender under pillows to keep nightmares away. Because comfort changes slowly, and superstition even slower. There's something poetic about that tension, the modern bed frame made of iron, sitting in a house that still smells faintly of hay. So when you lie in your own bed tonight, spring-supported, memory-foamed, perfectly contoured, you're lying on top of centuries of awkward experimentation. A long human trial in the pursuit of better rest. And maybe it's worth remembering that the first real mattress ads weren't selling sleep at all. They were selling identity, the idea that a person's worth could be measured by how comfortably they rested. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The more we engineered sleep, the less of it we seem to get. Now, let's drift a little further, into the 20th century, the age of advertisements, waterbeds, and the glamorous promise of modern comfort. Because, naturally, once humans perfected something, they immediately found a way to make it ridiculous again. What about you? Do you think the old straw bed or the new spring one would suit you better? Tell me in the comments, and maybe, just maybe, hey there, you made it through the straw, the feathers, and the iron. So now, let's float gently into the 20th century, the age when sleep stopped being a simple necessity and became a lifestyle. By this point, the Industrial Revolution had already taught humanity one thing. Everything can be improved, standardized, and sold, even the act of lying down. Factories no longer just built the beds. They built the dreams that went with them. It's funny to think about. For thousands of years, people just wanted to avoid rocks in their backs. By the 1900s, they were flipping through glossy catalogs, comparing thread counts and luxury quilting. Somewhere along the way, the human race turned sleeping into a competitive sport. But it didn't start in luxury stores. The modern bed, as we know it, really came out of hospitals. In 1874, an American named Willis Gatch invented something simple but revolutionary: a 3-section bed that could adjust to a patient's body. He wasn't thinking of comfort, he was thinking of practicality, preventing bed sores, helping nurses, keeping the sick alive. But his invention quietly reshaped the way people thought about rest. If a bed could be engineered to make the dying more comfortable, why couldn't it make the living more comfortable too? By the early 1900s, adjustable beds began appearing in catalogs, first as curiosities, then as luxuries. They were called reclining couches or scientific sleepers. Ads promised that with one, you'd rise refreshed and pain-free, like a modern emperor. Because of course they did. Meanwhile, the great mattress companies of the world were beginning to merge and multiply. Simmons, Sealy, and Serta, those names we still hear whispered in commercials, were all born in this era. Each promised a better night's rest through technology. Sealy's 1906 slogan declared, "Sleep on a Sealy, built like the human body." Which sounds oddly clinical, but people loved it. They were selling not just beds, but faith in progress. A soft, coil-sprung optimism that things were getting better, one nap at a time. And as the world moved through war, depression, and reconstruction, the bed became more than a piece of furniture. It became a tiny, private kingdom. After the horror of World War I, people longed for safety, and marketing caught on quickly. Bedrooms were redesigned to feel serene, personal, and secure. Women's magazines showed images of bright, sanitary rooms with crisp white linens, the perfect domestic cocoon. In those photos, no one looked restless. No one dreamed of trenches or rationing. They simply rested. It was the kind of peace people wanted to believe in again. The 1930s brought another quiet shift. Mass production met style. Bed frames turned streamlined and elegant, inspired by Art Deco design. Mattresses started using new materials like cotton batting and rubber foam. And that's when it happened. Humanity's most absurd, yet somehow brilliant, contribution to the history of sleep, the waterbed. Technically, the idea goes back further, to the 1830s, when a Scottish physician named Neil Arnott built a hydrostatic bed for his patients. It was a rubber mattress filled with warm water, designed to reduce pressure sores. The Victorians loved the idea but couldn't make it practical. Then, in 1968, an American design student named Charles Hall revisited the concept. He presented the waterbed as a project for his industrial design class, describing it as a liquid support for the human body. His professor gave him a C. But Hall went on to patent it, and the 1970s went wild. The waterbed became a cultural symbol, marketed with equal parts science and sensuality. "It's like sleeping on a gentle tide," one ad promised, while another claimed it brings harmony to your relationship. Which is a polite way of saying the thing sloshed like a pond every time you moved. Still, people adored them. Waterbeds represented freedom, rebellion, modernity, a break from the rigid brass beds of their grandparents. And in that sense, they were revolutionary. They blurred the line between furniture and experience. By the early 1980s, nearly 1 in 5 American households had one. Bedrooms sounded like aquariums, and plumbers made fortunes fixing leaks. Of course, it didn't last. By the late 90s, most people had given up and returned to solid ground. Turns out, changing the sheets on a 200-gallon water balloon wasn't as romantic as advertised. But for a time, it symbolized something deeply human, the desire to make rest feel extraordinary. And as waterbeds faded, new materials rose: foam, latex, polyester, and eventually memory foam. Memory foam has a surprisingly military origin. It was developed in the 1960s by NASA scientists, not for comfort but for crash safety. The material was designed to absorb impact during flights. But when researchers noticed how it conformed to body shape, someone inevitably thought, hey, that'd make a great mattress. By the 1990s, Tempur-Pedic had turned it into a global phenomenon. Their commercials showed glass wine glasses balancing perfectly as people jumped on the bed, a hypnotic symbol of calm stability. Ironically, most buyers didn't care about pressure absorption or temperature regulation. They just liked that it looked futuristic. Humans had gone from sleeping in caves to sleeping on literal space foam. And yet, the complaints were the same as ever: too hot, too firm, too weird. That's the great comedy of comfort. It's always one step ahead of satisfaction. By the 20th century's end, mattresses had become minor marvels of engineering. Multi-layered, coil-counted, infused with everything from aloe vera to ionizing copper threads. Some even had built-in speakers for sleep music, because apparently, we can't just close our eyes anymore. Even the humble pillow got reinvented. Goose feathers gave way to synthetic fills, then to contour memory foam, and now to so-called smart pillows that monitor your sleep cycles through Bluetooth. Yes, the object that once caught drool now collects data. But that's the curious thing about modern sleep: the more we measure it, the less peaceful it seems to become. For ancient people, sleep was simply something that happened when it got dark. For Victorians, it was a moral exercise. For us, it's a performance metric. We track it, optimize it, and complain about it online. We read articles about sleep hygiene while scrolling at 1 a.m. under blue light. We've replaced the rooster's crow with the phone alarm's chime. And yet, the need remains the same: to rest, to retreat, to stop existing for a few hours. If you look at it that way, every bed, from the straw heap to the memory foam slab, tells the same story: a desperate attempt to make the simplest act in the world feel secure again. Of course, the 20th century didn't just change how we slept. It also changed where we slept. For the first time, people began living alone in large numbers. Bedrooms shrank, then grew again, then became minimalist, then maximalist. Designers argued over headboards, thread counts, color palettes. And yes, even sleep got political. In the 1950s, domestic ads sold mattresses as symbols of marital harmony. "A happy couple sleeps on a orthopedic," said one cheery ad, featuring a woman in pearls, smiling faintly at her husband like he'd just fixed the roof. By the 1970s, the same mattress companies were selling independence: your side, your comfort. Sleep was no longer communal, it was personalized. Two halves of a bed, two separate dreams. Maybe that's progress. Maybe it's just loneliness with better upholstery. But if we zoom out for a moment, past all the technology, past the marketing, past the endless memory foam wars, we see something oddly touching. No matter the century, people have always believed they could engineer peace. That if they just stuffed the right feathers, shaped the right springs, arranged the right sheets, they might finally rest. It's such a human illusion to think serenity can be manufactured. And yet, we keep trying. Because every generation has its own version of the perfect bed, and every one of them, eventually, becomes quaint. Someday, our smart mattresses will look as laughable as the waterbeds of the 1970s. Some future historian will whisper about our obsession with sleep data, the way we now whisper about kings afraid of glass bones. But that's the cycle, isn't it? We build, we rest, We complain, we build again. And still, the best nights of sleep tend to happen not on the newest mattress, but on the one that feels like home, creaky, lumpy, familiar. So, as we drift further into the story of sleep, maybe the point isn't perfection at all. Maybe it's learning to surrender. To stop improving rest, and just rest. Now, before you drift off completely, tell me in the comments, do you think your current bed would impress a 17th century noble? Or would they faint at the sight of your memory foam pillow? Either way, take a deep breath, let your shoulders sink, and let's wander, next time, into how the world started marketing not just beds, but dreams themselves. So here we are, at the end of our long, sleepy journey through straw, feathers, and steel springs. You've seen how people went from sleeping on bare dirt floors, to suspending themselves on ropes, to resting on mattresses that cost more than old houses. But this last part, this modern chapter, isn't really about what we sleep on. It's about who sells it to us. Because sometime around the late 20th century, sleep stopped being a private act and became a product. The moment it happened was quiet. No announcement, no invention, no single turning point. Just a gradual realization among advertisers and corporations. If people are spending a third of their lives asleep, then that third can be monetized. The earliest signs came in the 1950s. Television was new, marketing was exploding, and the world had just survived 2 wars. People wanted peace, comfort, and stability. They wanted homes that felt secure again. And so, mattress companies began telling a story. They didn't just sell fabric and coils, they sold dreams. A Sealy ad from 1957 showed a smiling woman in a spotless bedroom. Her husband reading nearby, their matching pajamas pressed like uniforms. The text read, "Tomorrow's happiness begins tonight. Sleep on a Sealy." That tagline, simple, soft, turned rest into aspiration. It made comfort moral again. After years of chaos, people were ready to believe that a good night's sleep could fix a broken world. By the 1960s and 70s, marketing had changed tone. Now it was about freedom. A bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place to be yourself. Ads showed couples laughing in white sheets, sunlight spilling in like a blessing. Every mattress promised liberation from stress, conformity, and fatigue. The bedroom became a symbol of identity. You could almost hear the whisper. If you can't control the world, at least you can control your sleep. The same era gave rise to something else, the celebrity endorsement. Frank Sinatra was rumored to have a special mattress, handcrafted to cradle the spine of a star. Hotels began advertising their beds like luxury cars, the same mattress used at the plaza. Sleep became status. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. For the first time, people didn't just buy mattresses when they needed one. They upgraded them, for prestige, for comfort, for pride. It was the birth of the dream industry. The 1980s turned that dream fluorescent. Everything was bigger, bolder, louder, and mattresses were no exception. Thick pillow tops, pastel designs, endless layers of padding. Every brand promised the science of sleep. But no one cared about the science. They cared about how it felt to imagine they were sleeping better than anyone else. One ad from 1986 simply said, "Because you deserve it." That was the key, not function but validation. Buying a mattress became a small rebellion against exhaustion. Meanwhile, sleep scientists were making discoveries about REM cycles, circadian rhythms, and melatonin. Their research quietly fed the marketing machine. Now every commercial claimed to be clinically proven or doctor recommended. It didn't matter if it was true. It just needed to sound smart enough to justify the price. Then came the digital age, and with it, an entirely new kind of sleep. The internet bed boom. If you've been online any time since 2015, you've seen them. Casper, Purple, Nectar, Emma, Sleep Number. Sleek names, pastel branding, free shipping, 100-night trials. The pitch was perfect. Forget the showroom. Forget the pushy salesman. Just click and sleep. Mattresses compressed into cardboard boxes. Arrived at your door like giant gifts. And unfurled with a hiss that somehow felt futuristic. For the first time in history, You could order your night's rest the same way you ordered takeout. And it worked. Casper sold more than 1 million mattresses in under 5 years. Dozens of clones followed. The mattress industry became a battlefield, not of comfort, but of algorithms. Ads targeted your insomnia. Cookies tracked your midnight browsing. Your phone overheard you complaining about back pain and showed you an ad at 2 a.m. promising salvation for $995. The dream industry had become automated. But here's the strange, quiet irony. For all our smart beds, tracking apps, and wellness rituals, we've never slept worse. Surveys show that global sleep quality has declined, even as comfort technology has improved. Blue light, caffeine, stress, information overload, all of it keeps the brain humming. We go to bed tired but not peaceful. Our minds scroll even when our eyes close. It's as if the more we try to optimize rest, the more restless we become. In the past, people simply collapsed. After walking, working, surviving. Sleep wasn't scheduled, it was earned. Now, it's managed like a performance review. Tracked, graded, analyzed. Some people even share their sleep data on social media. A new kind of humble brag. Look, 8 hours. Deep sleep score 92. But the truth is, you can't hack surrender. Sleep will always resist control. Still, the marketing keeps evolving. Now, companies sell not just mattresses, but entire lifestyles. Sleep masks with Bluetooth, weighted blankets for anxiety, aromatherapy diffusers, sound baths, and melatonin gummies shaped like cartoon moons. The 21st century turned sleep into a kind of religion, and the bed into an altar. And in that sense, we've come full circle. Because for ancient Egyptians, the bed was also sacred. A symbol of the afterlife. A place of transformation. When they lay down, they believed they were entering the realm of dreams, a rehearsal for eternity. Today, we may not build gold frames or carve hieroglyphs into our bedposts. But the belief is still there, hiding in the quiet of every night. That if we lie still enough, if we close our eyes just right, we might drift somewhere beyond the noise. The bed has always mirrored who we are. The straw of the peasant, the velvet of the king, the waterbed of the dreamer, the memory foam of the modern warrior. Each one says something about its owner, about what they fear, and what they hope to find when the lights go out. In a medieval hut, the bed was a shared space, warmth and survival. In a Victorian home, it was moral and private, modesty and duty. In our century, it's personal and curated, individuality and anxiety. But the act itself hasn't changed. We still lie down. We still surrender. That's the part that never evolves. And maybe that's the secret moral of this long, boring history. That the bed isn't really about technology or status or comfort. It's about permission. The permission to stop pretending. To stop moving. To stop being awake in a world that never shuts up. When you climb into bed, no matter how old or new it is, you step into a tradition older than firelight. A silent agreement shared by billions before you. It's okay to rest now. That's what the first pile of hay meant. That's what the first pillow said. That's what every bed, from palaces to cardboard boxes, has always whispered. You're safe for a while. So if you're lying there right now, listening to this, eyes half closed, mind drifting between the past and your own small worries, just remember, the world has been chasing sleep for thousands of years. And you've inherited every version of that chase. You are, in a strange way, part of history. A living continuation of that ancient, gentle struggle to find peace between two sunrises. And maybe that's enough reason to rest easy tonight. Because no matter how many centuries pass, no matter what material we invent next, graphene foam, dream sensors, zero-gravity pods, it will still come down to the same ancient ritual. A body, a surface, a sigh, a surrender. And as you drift off tonight, think of them, the farmers and kings, sailors and queens, monks and nomads, each lying down, centuries apart, on straw, on wood, on silk, on steel. each whispering their own version of the same quiet prayer. Let me sleep. Soft outro music plays. If you made it this far, thank you for staying awake through the world's most boring story. Or maybe, hopefully, for not staying awake at all. If you're still here, don't forget to breathe deeply. And maybe leave a comment when you wake up. Would you rather try a medieval rope bed? Or a 1970s waterbed for one night? Sweet dreams. And I'll see you in the next story. Let's float back to the 1800s, the century that managed to invent almost everything and ruin sleep a little in the process. Because before the Victorians, sleeping was mostly practical. You collapsed wherever it was warmest, softest, or least damp. A bed was a structure, not a statement. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and with it came a strange new invention: privacy. For the first time, ordinary middle-class people could afford more than one room. And when there's more than one room, you get choices: where to eat, where to sit, and, of course, where to sleep. The bedroom became a new kind of space, sealed off, moralized, and heavy with unspoken rules. Victorians believed the bed was sacred. Not religious sacred, though sometimes that too, but socially sacred. What happened there was private, and privacy, to them, was almost divine. It was where the self got rebuilt after a long day of pretending to be proper. This made decorating your bedroom a moral act. Lace curtains meant virtue. Modest headboards signaled restraint. Heavy drapes kept out prying eyes, drafts, and anything resembling fresh air. They turned sleep into theater, complete with props and costume changes. The costume, by the way, was pajamas. Pajamas, or pajamas, as the British wrote it, were borrowed from South Asia, where loose cotton sleepwear had been worn for centuries. British colonials, sweating through Indian nights, realized that sleeping in nightshirts was neither practical nor elegant. So they brought home the idea, attached buttons, stiffened collars, and called it civilized. By the late 1800s, every respectable man owned a pair. Women, naturally, were discouraged from wearing them. Nightgowns were their domain, yards of cotton or silk, layered enough to make fainting halfway through the night a realistic possibility. It's strange, really. They invented privacy just to make sleep more complicated. Bedmaking became another small ritual of moral hygiene. Servants were trained to air the sheets each morning, throwing them open to banish night vapors, which supposedly carried sickness and sin in equal measure. Feather beds were fluffed, sheets ironed, and pillows beaten into submission. Every movement was meant to restore purity, as if the mere act of sleeping, of lying still and vulnerable, had somehow sullied the soul. And this, oddly, is where the bedtime routine began. Before, people just slept when they were tired. Now, there was an order: wash, pray, brush, read, extinguish the lamp. For children, the ritual became almost liturgical. Nannies would whisper bedtime stories, moral parables disguised as lullabies, teaching that good children went to bed early and dreamt politely. Bad children, well, they got nightmares. It was moral architecture disguised as comfort. Furniture makers joined the movement. A proper 19th century bed wasn't just large, it was dramatic. Mahogany, walnut, and oak were carved into towering shapes, with canopies and curtains that blocked out both light and accountability. In some houses, beds were so ornate that they looked more like altars than furniture. Sleeping in one was an experience, a nightly coronation of the self. And yet, for all their grandeur, many were uncomfortable. The springs squeaked, the mattresses sagged, and bedbugs thrived in every crevice. Victorians, ever pragmatic, dealt with this by inventing euphemisms. They called bedbugs domestic companions, and lice tiny nuisances. It's the same kind of denial that led them to build coal fires beside curtains of lace. Still, they believed they'd perfected the art of rest. By the late 1800s, sleep had become a class marker. The poor slept where they could, the rich slept where they wanted. Factory workers often shared beds in shifts, one sleeper getting up just as another lay down. It was called hot bedding, because the mattress was literally still warm from the last occupant. In London boarding houses, some landlords rented beds by the hour. Meanwhile, aristocrats bragged about how little they slept, treating exhaustion as a sign of importance. Napoleon claimed he needed only 4 hours. Queen Victoria's doctor recommended 5. Sleep was suddenly political. To rest too much meant laziness, to rest too little meant nobility. The irony, of course, is that both groups were equally miserable. There was also the strange obsession with air. Every good Victorian home had strict rules about ventilation. Too much air, and you risked catching night chills. Too little, and you might suffocate in your own carbon dioxide. The compromise was to open one small window an inch, but only after the servants had finished dusting the curtains. Doctors wrote pamphlets about the dangers of stale bedroom atmosphere. One even advised sprinkling vinegar on the sheets to purify the air, an idea that made beds smell faintly like salad dressing. But the goal wasn't comfort. It was control. Every part of life, from mealtimes to mattress firmness, was supposed to follow reason. And reason, unfortunately, is not very restful. This era also gave us something quietly revolutionary: the idea that sleep should happen alone. Before the 19th century, shared beds were normal. Families slept together for warmth and safety. Servants sometimes shared rooms with employers. Guests shared mattresses in inns. But as privacy became a virtue, sharing became suspicious. It blurred moral boundaries. It invited gossip. So couples began to separate, first with 2 mattresses in one frame, then with 2 beds in one room, and finally, in extreme cases, with entirely separate bedrooms. It was considered refined, civilized, a sign of maturity. In truth, it was just another way of turning intimacy into architecture. By the end of the century, the bedroom had become the emotional center of the home. It was where women fainted from tight corsets, where men smoked and read secret letters, where servants tiptoed with water jugs and chamber pots. It was private enough for honesty but decorated enough for denial. Every wrinkle in the bedsheet had meaning. Every candlestick told a story. And all of it, every moral, every curtain, every sigh, set the stage for the modern world's strangest contradiction: that the more we tried to make sleep perfect, the harder it became to actually do it. So the 19th century gave us pajamas, ventilation, bedtime routines, and privacy. But it also gave us guilt, expectation, and the haunting sense that even unconsciousness should be performed gracefully. We learned how to look peaceful, not how to be peaceful. And maybe that's the real inheritance of the Victorian bed, the idea that rest must be earned. If you could time travel to that world, lace, mahogany, and candlelight, do you think you'd sleep better or worse than you do now? Let me know in the comments when you wake up. Let's drift quietly onward to the next part. Let's drift now, to the age when the sun never set on certain empires. And yet, somehow, everyone in them was still exhausted. The 19th century was the great age of expansion, of ships, colonies, maps, and overconfidence. Europe's ruling classes set out to civilize the world, but mostly ended up exporting furniture and bad sleeping habits. Because wherever the empire went, the bed went too. If you were a British officer sailing for India or Africa around 1850, you'd pack your uniform, your pistol, and, most importantly, your campaign bed. These were portable contraptions of brass and canvas, designed to fold and unfold like nervous origami. They looked simple, but the logistics of sleeping comfortably while conquering a continent were surprisingly complex. An officer's bed had to be shipped across oceans, carried by porters, reassembled in tents, and still somehow signal authority. Some even had mosquito net canopies and little attached shelves, so the man could rest his tea next to his revolver. It was a contradiction in brass and linen. Comfort brought to uncomfortable places. Meanwhile, local people often looked at these setups and politely tried not to laugh. Because, of course, they had been sleeping just fine without all that nonsense for centuries. In tropical colonies, hammocks, mats, or simple wooden frames worked perfectly. They allowed airflow, discouraged insects, and required no shipping crates. But Europeans, in their eternal wisdom, declared such sleeping methods primitive, and insisted on sweating through nights in heavy cotton sheets under 4 layers of blankets. One missionary wrote in 1873, "The native bed is but a mat upon the ground, which strikes one as most barbarous." He did not, however, mention that he had malaria. Mosquito nets deserve a quiet moment of appreciation. They were one of the few pieces of colonial sleep gear that actually made sense. Invented centuries earlier in Asia and Africa, nets were adopted enthusiastically by European colonists. But only after they had rebranded them as modern hygienic equipment. There were rules for how to use them, how to tuck them, fold them, treat them with chemicals. Some officers even had servants trained exclusively in net arrangement. Because apparently arranging one's own mosquito net was beneath the dignity of empire. At night, inside those gauzy cocoons, men wrote long letters home about missing the good beds of England, and about the constant, lonely hum of the tropics outside the netting. It was the sound of a world they would never quite belong to. Back in Europe, the empire came home in its own way. Travelers returned with souvenirs, silk cushions, bamboo daybeds, low wooden couches. Oriental styles became fashionable in London and Paris bedrooms. People who had never left Europe began decorating as if they'd just returned from a grand expedition. It was colonialism in fabric form, comfort stolen, softened, and rebranded as exotic luxury. A British socialite might recline on a Bombay chaise and sigh about the heat, while a Parisian artist painted himself napping on a divan à la Turque. It was all pretend, of course. They wanted the dream of elsewhere without the inconvenience of being there. Meanwhile, outside the mansions, the working classes were also redefining sleep, but out of necessity, not taste. Industrial expansion had created new cities, crowded and dirty, full of temporary workers. In factory districts, families slept in shifts to save space. Children curled on piles of rags or under staircases. And the word bedroom was often an exaggeration. A single bed shared by 5 was common. The contrast was obscene. On one side of empire, imported silks, travel journals, perfumed pillows. On the other, soot, noise, and broken springs. Sleep was no longer just biological, it was political. Who got to rest, and how well, became a measure of power. Still, empire had its dreamers. Explorers and naturalists who genuinely believed they were expanding knowledge, not just territory. They wrote tenderly about nights spent under strange skies. About waking to the sounds of jungles or deserts. About realizing that the human need for rest was the one universal truth they could find. Charles Darwin, on the Beagle, wrote that his hammock rocked him gently like the tides of thought. David Livingstone once described falling asleep on the African plains, listening to lions in the distance and thinking, rather poetically, that nature keeps her own watchman. There were moments of humility, too, when empire forgot its arrogance long enough to notice how small it really was against the night. But most of the time, it was business as usual. Colonial officers built rest houses for travelers, halfway stations stocked with imported bedding and British tea. There were manuals on how to Europeanize one's sleep abroad, including helpful instructions like, do not sleep upon native mats, which may induce moral decay. Yes, moral decay. Apparently, even horizontal posture had ethical consequences. Missionaries scolded converts for sleeping communally, calling it immodest and lacking in Christian restraint. They taught villagers to build separate beds, separate rooms, separate everything, and congratulated themselves for spreading civilization. It's amazing how something as innocent as a nap could become a cultural battlefield. And yet, even as empire collapsed under its own contradictions, one legacy endured: the global homogenization of sleep. Beds became taller, softer, more standardized. Feather pillows and iron frames spread to places that had never needed them. Mattresses replaced mats, curtains replaced nets. The world started to dream the same dream, or at least, to buy it from the same catalog. By the early 20th century, global trade had made it possible to order a bed from London and have it shipped to Calcutta. Sleep had been packaged, shipped, and sold like any other product of empire. There's something bittersweet in that. Because while comfort did improve for many, diversity disappeared. The quiet logic of local sleep, tuned to climate, culture, and rhythm, got replaced by imported ideals. People began to sleep in foreign ways, on foreign fabrics, chasing a foreign idea of rest. The empire may have fallen, but its bedtime still rules the world. So tonight, as you stretch out on your own modern mattress, somewhere in the long shadow of all that history, it's worth remembering that your bed, the shape, the height, the materials, probably owes something to empire. The cotton might trace back to India. the design to Victorian London, the comfort to countless unknown hands who never got much sleep themselves. And that's the irony. The people who built the world's beds were usually too tired to use them. If you could sleep anywhere in history, under a mosquito net in a jungle, on a ship in a storm, or in a candlelit colonial bedroom pretending to be exotic, where would you choose? Tell me when you wake up. And we'll keep drifting. Let's move softly into the next part. The industrial sleeper. Close your eyes and imagine a city that never truly gets dark. The year is 1880. The factories of Manchester, Chicago, and Berlin beat like iron hearts. Day blends into night in a blur of smoke and gears. And for the first time in history, the human body has to compete with the machine. Welcome to the century when people stopped sleeping naturally and started sleeping by schedule. Before the Industrial Revolution, sleep had been flexible. It followed the sun. Farmers went to bed after dusk, woke before dawn, and rested when the fields were wet or the wind too cold. Sleep had rhythm, human rhythm. But factories changed everything. Suddenly, your rest wasn't guided by stars or roosters. It was ruled by whistles and clocks. Shift bells replaced birdsong. Work started at 6 a.m. whether you were tired or not, and ended when the machines did, which increasingly was never. Imagine a textile worker in Manchester around 1850. Her name might be Mary. She's 17. She wakes at 4:30, walks through the fog, and starts her 12-hour shift by sunrise. Inside the mill, the air is thick with lint. The looms thunder. She barely hears her own breath. When the whistle blows at dusk, she walks home. Her face gray with dust. Her eyes red from fatigue. She eats something simple, maybe bread or boiled potatoes. Then collapses on her straw mattress in a shared room with 4 others. There's no nighttime ritual. No peace. Just exhaustion that feels like drowning in wool. Working-class sleep became a strange new thing. Shallow, divided, and never enough. Doctors of the time even coined new terms for it: industrial fatigue, factory insomnia, nervous depletion. They were the early words for what we now call burnout. The wealthy noticed, but mostly to scold. Victorian newspapers ran articles warning workers not to oversleep, as if fatigue were a moral failure. But how do you oversleep when you never get enough? The rich, meanwhile, were inventing an entirely new relationship with rest. They turned sleep into a virtue, a sign of refinement, of being above manual labor. By the 1890s, London magazines offered tips for the perfect slumber. Silk pajamas, lavender pillows, low light, quiet hearts. Sleep became a performance. You had to look rested, even if you weren't. Doctors published guides about sleep hygiene, the first time the phrase appeared in print. They warned against heavy suppers, alcohol, or reading emotional novels before bed. Victorian morality extended even into your dreams. But the real revolution in rest came not from morals, but from light. Gas lamps, and later electricity, rewrote the very idea of night. Cities glowed. Shadows retreated. And humans lost the ancient boundary between day and dark. Historian Wolfgang Schivelbusch once said, "The night was colonized." And he was right. Before electric light, night was a shared silence. After it, it became opportunity, to work, to produce, to stay awake longer than nature intended. Newspapers celebrated the 24-hour city. Factories bragged about round-the-clock production. And insomnia quietly became a symbol of progress. Because in a world obsessed with productivity, sleep began to look suspiciously like laziness. And yet, even amid all this noise and steel, there were small acts of rebellion. Workers who napped on lunch breaks, leaning against walls. Newspapers that ran moral debates about rest for the poor. Writers who romanticized sleep as a return to humanity. Charles Dickens wrote passionately about sleeplessness. He would walk through London at 3 a.m., past slums and silent warehouses, thinking about all the souls trapped in this new machine age. He once said that insomnia was the ghost of the working man, wandering the alleys at night. In the growing cities of America, sleep became a measure of class in another way. Hotels, boarding houses, and tenements each offered their own kind of rest, or lack of it. A bed in a respectable boarding house might cost a day's wage. But in New York's Lower East Side, there were penny sleeps, benches or ropes to lean against, rented by the hour. Yes, ropes. You could literally pay to hang your arms over a sagging rope in a crowded room and nap sitting up. It was called a four-penny rope sleep, and it existed because even the poorest needed some kind of horizontal mercy. It was cheap, temporary, and utterly dehumanizing. But it was also survival. Doctors began to study sleep as a social problem. In 1894, a London report concluded that sleep poverty is among the chief engines of misery. But industry kept expanding. Trains roared. Telegraphs clicked through the night. And the new disease of sleepless modernity took root. Yet, paradoxically, it was also the industrial age that gave birth to modern dreams. Freud was writing in Vienna, arguing that dreams were secret maps of the unconscious, that beneath the soot and the schedules, the human mind still rebelled, in symbols, in stories, in sleep. Factories made the body mechanical. Freud tried to prove the mind was still alive inside the machine. It's poetic, really. As the world industrialized the day, humanity industrialized the night. There's another side to this story, one that flickers quietly in the corners of history. The invention of the bedroom itself. Before the 19th century, few people had private rooms for sleeping. Families shared one bed, one space. But in cities, as the middle class grew, privacy became a luxury, and then a moral expectation. Bedrooms became sanctuaries, separated from work, food, and noise. The modern home divided life into boxes: the parlor for hosting, the kitchen for cooking, the bedroom for sleep. It was the architecture of control. Every activity in its proper compartment. Sleep was no longer communal. It became private, individualized, even secret. And with privacy came loneliness. Writers of the late 19th century began to notice this new solitude. They wrote poems about the alienation of falling asleep alone, surrounded by the sounds of a mechanical city. A journalist in 1898 described it perfectly. Outside, the tramlines hum. Inside, the mind hums louder. Even sleep, once a shared silence, became another echo chamber of industry. Of course, not everyone wanted this new way of living. Some resisted. Rural communities clung to segmented sleep. Tonight split between first sleep and second sleep, a rhythm older than the clock. They lit candles, read, or prayed in the long middle hours. They didn't call it insomnia, it was just part of being human. But by 1900, this pattern had almost vanished from industrial cities. The two-phase night gave way to the 8-hour block, a product of factory scheduling and efficiency. Our modern, standard sleep isn't natural. It's manufactured. And that idea, that even our dreams could be standardized, quietly terrified people. Writers began to turn sleep into a symbol of rebellion. In 1908, Jack London wrote The Apostate, about a factory child who works himself numb. At the end, he collapses in the field and sleeps the sleep of all eternity, not as tragedy, but as freedom. To rest in that world was to revolt. But out of all this fatigue came progress too. Labor unions began to fight for humane working hours. And the 8-hour movement was born. 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, 8 for what we will. It took decades, but eventually, rest became a right, not just a privilege. That idea, the right to sleep, changed the modern world more than any invention of steel or steam. Still, even as the 20th century dawned, sleeplessness lingered like a shadow behind the electric glow. People were no longer dying from lack of food or shelter alone, but from overwork, anxiety, and light. Doctors wrote about nervous exhaustion, industrial neurasthenia, modern fatigue syndrome. And they prescribed, ironically, rest cures. Patients were told to retreat to quiet countryside homes, lie down for days, and think of nothing. It worked for some. But for most, rest prescribed by doctors felt like imprisonment by silence. One writer said, "The rest cure took away my body, and left me only my thoughts, which never slept." Sleep had become something to earn, something to fix, something to control. And in that control, something ancient was lost. Because sleep, once the great equalizer of kings and farmers alike, had become just another measure of class, discipline, and efficiency. The factory bell still rang, even in our dreams. So when you close your eyes tonight, beneath the quiet hum of your own machines, your phone charging, your fridge buzzing, the city breathing outside, remember that you are still living in the world those factories built. Your 8-hour night, your alarm clock, your sense of guilt when you oversleep, all of it was forged in that iron century. But perhaps there's comfort in knowing that even in the harshest age of noise, people still dreamed. They dreamed of fields without smoke, of skies without glare, of nights long enough to remember what it meant to rest without permission. And in those dreams, the human heart whispered softly to itself, "I am not a machine." The hum quiets now, and the city begins to fade into mist. Next time, we'll step into the 20th century, where sleep becomes science, advertising, and aspiration. The world learns to sell dreams. Close your eyes, and we'll drift there together. Hey there. Still awake? That's all right, because so were most people at the start of the 1900s. The night had become brighter, busier, and louder than ever before. And for the first time in history, people began to worry about their sleep. It started innocently enough, with electricity and marketing. When the light bulb spread across cities, companies suddenly had to convince people to stop working, to actually turn the lights off and rest. An odd problem to have, really. After centuries of trying to stay awake, humanity had to relearn how to go to bed. Newspapers printed advice columns about the art of sleeping. Women's magazines featured diagrams of proper sleeping posture. And for the first time, the mattress became a status symbol. Beds were sold not just for comfort, but for identity. You weren't just buying a place to rest. You were buying peace. And of course, peace had a price tag. The early 20th century adored self-improvement, and sleep became one more arena to optimize. There were exercises to improve circulation, breathing regimens to prevent night vapors, and entire guidebooks with titles like The Correct Use of the Bedchamber. Doctors weighed in too. They studied how many hours you should sleep, and decided, somewhat arbitrarily, on 8. 8 hours became the magic number. Round, respectable, and easy to remember. The 8-hour ideal was born out of convenience more than science. But it stuck so well that we still whisper it like gospel. If you slept less, you were careless. If you slept more, you were weak. Sleep itself became a mirror of character. Then came Freud, and everything got more complicated. He published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. And suddenly everyone believed their subconscious was whispering in code each night. Dreams became moral puzzles, and sleep became psychological theater. People started analyzing themselves before breakfast. What does it mean that I dreamt of a staircase? What if I dreamt of my mother and a staircase? The bedroom turned from a place of rest into a stage for the mind's deepest anxieties. The First World War deepened that anxiety. Sleep became rare, haunted, fractured. Soldiers slept in trenches, half-conscious, waiting for the next shell. And when they came home, many found they couldn't sleep at all. Shell shock, doctors called it, a new word for a very old condition. In peacetime, the sleeplessness spread quietly through the cities. There were too many lights, too many machines, too many memories. The 1920s tried to make sleep glamorous again. This was the age of Art Deco hotels, luxury linens, and chic insomnia. Because even rest could be fashionable. You could buy a sleepy time radio that played soft orchestral tunes, or bottles of soothing syrup, a chemical cocktail promising instant oblivion. There were beauty sleeps and sleep masks. Pajamas became couture, and dreams were marketed like perfume. People had never been so tired, or so obsessed with appearing rested. In America, the mattress business exploded. Companies competed to invent comfort. Cotton stuffing gave way to springs. Springs gave way to latex. and latex gave way to foam. Every decade promised the bed of the future. One ad from the 1930s showed a woman smiling in a spotless bedroom, holding a clock. The slogan read, "Sleep 8 hours, look 10 years younger." Because, naturally, sleep was no longer just about health. It was about youth. And vanity never goes out of style. By mid-century, psychologists began warning that industrial civilization had created a sleep deficit. But few people listened. The world was too busy winning wars, building suburbs, and selling televisions. And those televisions, they invaded the bedroom. By the 1950s, families were falling asleep not to silence, but to glowing screens. Late-night shows became cultural lullabies. And for the first time, people started drifting to sleep beside the endless hum of entertainment. It was comforting, in its way. The flicker of the TV replaced the flicker of firelight. The stories never stopped, and neither did the light. The 1960s brought pills into the picture. Barbiturates, sedatives, tranquilizers, all marketed as modern miracles. They promised rest without dreams, peace in a bottle, sleep at your command. But the side effects were grim. Dependence, confusion, memory loss. Sleep, it turned out, was not something that could be manufactured. Still, millions tried. The era of chemical slumber had begun. By the late 1970s, Americans were taking enough sleeping pills to fill swimming pools. Doctors began to worry, not because people couldn't sleep, but because they no longer trusted sleep to happen naturally. And so came the age of sleep anxiety. People started keeping track of their own rest, timing it, comparing it, quantifying it. Magazines ran headlines like, "Are you sleeping wrong?" Because there's nothing like guilt to sell subscriptions. Even science joined in. Researchers built laboratories full of volunteers wired up like Christmas trees. They watched brainwaves flicker through the night and mapped every stage of the human dream. REM, NREM, stage 1 through 4. Sleep was dissected into data. It was extraordinary research. But it also made something simple seem fragile. Once you start thinking about how to fall asleep, you rarely do. Through all this, the world kept getting noisier. Airplanes, refrigerators, neon signs, traffic. And so people began buying silence. Soundproof windows. White noise machines. Earplugs marketed as luxury sleep accessories. One company even sold a sleep dome, a translucent plastic bubble you placed over your bed to block sound. It looked ridiculous, but it sold out within weeks. Humans, it seemed, would pay anything to pretend the world still had darkness. And then came the suburbs. Wide, quiet, and carefully curated. Bedrooms grew larger, beds softer, and sleep turned into performance once again. People decorated their bedrooms with coordinated colors, floral lampshades, matching quilts. Not necessarily for comfort, but because a well-appointed bedroom indicates a well-regulated mind. That line came from a 1954 Home magazine, and it sums up the post-war obsession with domestic perfection. The messy, human side of sleep, snoring, drooling, tossing, became something to hide, even from your spouse. By the 1980s, people were buying separate blankets, separate beds, even separate rooms. Sleep divorce, they called it. A polite phrase for, "I can't stand the sound of your breathing." Meanwhile, hotels discovered that sleep was their best marketing tool. They trademarked Mattresses, Westin Heavenly Bed, Hilton Serenity Collection, Marriott Sleep Experience. Every hotel promised the best night's sleep of your life, which is, of course, impossible, but charming to imagine. You could spend hundreds of dollars to sleep just slightly better than at home, because the dream of perfect rest was now a product, one you could book by the night. Scientists tried to catch up. They discovered circadian rhythms, melatonin, blue light. They proved that teenagers really do need more sleep. That night shifts disrupt the body. That chronic exhaustion erodes memory. The knowledge was fascinating, but rarely comforting. Because the more we knew, the worse we seemed to sleep. By the 1990s, the problem was everywhere. There were sleep clinics in every major city, and talk shows about the fatigue epidemic. Magazines published sleep quizzes. Do you fall asleep within 10 minutes? Do you wake before your alarm? If you answered incorrectly, congratulations, you were a modern insomniac. The irony was rich. After centuries of fighting to stay awake, humanity was now terrified of not sleeping enough. We became, in a sense, haunted by rest. And then came the internet. The night got brighter again. Emails, late-night chats, 24-hour news. There was no longer such a thing as after hours. Phones buzzed beside pillows. People fell asleep scrolling, or didn't sleep at all. The insomnia that once haunted soldiers and poets became universal. Ordinary, invisible, chronic. Sleep had finally lost its mystery, but also its magic. Still, there were those who tried to reclaim it. Writers began to romanticize rest again. They spoke of slow living, digital sunsets, bedtime rituals. Magazines offered gentle advice. Take a bath, light a candle, breathe slowly, forgive yourself for the day. The tone had softened. As if, collectively, we realized that sleep isn't something to conquer, but something to surrender to. And maybe that's the secret modern people keep forgetting. You cannot force yourself to rest. You can only allow it. The more you chase sleep, the faster it runs. But if you give up the chase, it sometimes drifts back like a shy animal. So here we are, in the strange, humming world of constant light, with blackout curtains and sleep trackers, herbal teas and meditation apps, still trying to remember what our ancestors knew instinctively. That rest isn't earned by productivity. It's granted by kindness to yourself. Maybe that's why sleep videos like this exist. Why you're here, listening now, drifting through centuries of human exhaustion and invention, searching, quietly, for peace. If you were designing the perfect night's rest, what would it look like? Would it be silent, or filled with rain sounds? Would you sleep alone, or surrounded by family like people once did? Tell me in the comments when you wake up. I'm curious. But for now, don't move. Let the hum of the world fade away. 'Cause next, we're going to slip into the final stretch, where beds become pods, sleep becomes luxury again, and rest turns political. Close your eyes, and drift with me into the eternal bed. Hey there. You made it all the way through the centuries. From straw and furs to springs and screens. That's a long journey for a simple question. What do people sleep on, and what does it mean? Now we're here, in the age of comfort. Or maybe, the illusion of it. The modern bed is a strange thing. Part science experiment, part shrine. You can buy memory foam that remembers you better than some of your relatives. Adjustable frames that rise and fall at the push of a button. Pillows chilled by circulating water. And blankets that track your breathing through the night. You can even get mattresses shipped in boxes, vacuum sealed like frozen pizza. Because convenience, apparently, never sleeps. We live in a time when rest has become an industry worth billions. Entire companies built around the promise of better sleep. A new mattress brand seems to appear every month. Each one swearing it's not like the others, though they all look suspiciously similar. It's ironic. For most of human history, people slept on whatever was near. On hay, on hides, on wood. And now, with every comfort imaginable, we still can't quite relax. Technology hasn't made sleep easier. It's just made it measurable. We track it on watches, compare our sleep scores, and fret when the numbers aren't perfect. Imagine telling a medieval peasant that one day their descendants would stare at glowing rectangles to see if they slept well enough. They'd probably laugh and go back to their haystack. And yet, underneath the gadgets and graphs, our needs haven't changed at all. We still want the same things our ancestors did. Warmth, safety, quiet, someone breathing softly nearby, reminding us we're not alone in the dark. Even after thousands of years. That's all a bed really is. A small island of peace in a loud, unpredictable world. Some modern thinkers call sleep the last rebellion. In a world obsessed with productivity, to rest without purpose feels radical. You're not making money, not learning a skill, not posting anything. You're simply existing, briefly unmeasured. And that is quietly powerful. Minimalism has brought back older ideas too. Japanese futons laid directly on tatami mats. Scandinavian simplicity with plain white linen. People seeking calm in the absence of clutter. It's a kind of full circle. Back to when a bed was just a place to close your eyes, not a technological battleground. Meanwhile, cities have grown vertical, and people sleep in pods now. Tiny capsules stacked like drawers, glowing softly in blue light. You crawl in, lie flat, and seal the door. The pod hums quietly, the air cool, the mattress thin but perfectly supportive. It's efficient, sterile, and oddly serene. For travelers and overworked workers, these pods are miracles, but also small monuments to how much time we've stolen from rest itself. We have made sleep fit into our schedules, instead of our lives fitting around it. In other corners of the world, the bed remains deeply cultural. In the Middle East, sleep is social. Families gather on floor cushions, share one wide sleeping space, and talk softly until they drift away. In parts of Africa, bedding still follows the rhythm of weather and season. Mats rolled out when it's hot, layers of blankets when it's cold. In Nordic countries, couples use 2 duvets instead of 1. A charming compromise that saves marriages and warmth. Sleep, even now, mirrors how we live together, or apart. Scientists keep studying it. Psychologists keep analyzing it. But in the end, sleep isn't something to understand. It's something to surrender to. The harder you try to hold onto it, the faster it slips away. It's almost poetic that the one act we spend a third of our lives doing remains the one thing we can't do deliberately. We can prepare for it, invite it, but never force it. Sleep arrives when it decides to. And that's what keeps it beautiful. If the medieval peasant, the Victorian laborer, and the modern insomniac could somehow meet, they'd have very little in common, except that moment of lying down. That breath before drifting off. That hope that tomorrow will come gently. Maybe that's what binds us across centuries. Not our progress, not our inventions, but our fatigue. The truth is, humanity has always been tired. Tired of war, tired of work, tired of worry. We've changed our clothes, our gods, our beds. But never that. We rest because we must. Because even the proudest empires, the noisiest machines, the brightest cities, eventually grow quiet. Every civilization in history has ended the same way, with someone blowing out a candle and lying down to sleep. So tonight, as you pull the blanket a little closer, you are part of that same unbroken story. You are the echo of countless sleepers before you. The farmers who curled beside their animals. The nobles who dreamed on velvet. The sailors swaying in hammocks. The soldiers who closed their eyes for minutes between battles. All of them, just human beings, trying to rest. And maybe that's the comforting thing. That after all the progress, all the inventions, all the noise, we still end every day the same way. Lying down. And letting go. The bed is our truest inheritance. The one piece of furniture that never really changed in purpose. Only in price. So if you're listening to this as you fall asleep, you don't need to remember every detail. The straw beds, the rope frames, the feather ticks, the factory shifts. They'll still be here tomorrow. The story doesn't demand attention. It invites surrender. Let the words fade like distant bells, and the history dissolve into quiet. Before you go, though, I'll ask you one small thing. What's your idea of perfect sleep? Not in terms of brands or gadgets, but feeling. What does rest mean to you? Tell me in the comments when morning comes. I always like to read them. It feels like proof that we're all dreaming in the same long story. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If this little journey helped you unwind, you can leave a like. Share it with someone who could use a quiet moment. Or subscribe so you'll find your way back next time we wander through another sleepy corner of the past. For now, just breathe. The world can wait until morning. Good night.